everyone. Welcome to our second and final intergenerational dialogue this semester. This is a really special gathering today because we are hosting international scholars who work in the field of education. Before I introduce them, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Karen Thompson. I'm the chair of Gender and Sexuality Studies, as well as the director of the Consortium for Gender, Sexuality, Race, and Public Culture. And the consortium who's sponsoring the event today is essentially a Mellon-funded group that helps put forward work that impacts, that has a broad impact on public culture, and that is written also to address general public. So this is one of the things we're doing today. The purpose of the intergenerational dialogue is to have USC graduate students be in conversation with recent authors, especially in shared areas of expertise. So that's what we're here to do today. We're welcoming international scholar Sam Stiegler and LJ Slovin. Sam is currently a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellow and senior research fellow in the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne. And in addition to his work with LJ Slovin, Dr. Stiegler is also the author of Going Along with Trans, Queer, and Non-Binary Youth from SUNY Press. Previously, he held the Hunt Symes Visiting Junior Chair for Sexuality Studies at the University of Sydney, which is where we met actually back in the day. LJ Slovin. Am I pronouncing your last name properly?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. LJ Slovin is an assistant professor in the School for Child and Youth Care at the University of Victoria and a fellow at the Mark S. Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. That's at University of Toronto.
That's right.
They're the author of Fierce, Fabulous, and Fluid, How High School Students Work at Gender Nonconformity from MIT Press, which received a 2025 Critics' Book Choice Award from the American Educational Studies Association. And here, representing our fine graduate students at USC, we have Max Lubbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A first year PhD, sorry, that was my German accent.
Yes.
Max is a first year PhD student in American Studies and Ethnicity here at USC, and his research centers on transgender sounds and affects. She previously worked as a journalist with pieces in Chicago's NPR station, Colorado Public Radio, and Windy City Times. Kelso Becktol is a third-year PhD student in American Studies and Ethnicities here at USC, and they draw on pop culture, interviews, and archival material to consider how queerness, transness, and urban-rural dynamics shape the potentiality of living in and creating alternative social worlds. So I'm going to let you all take over and let us know what the format of the discussion is going to be, because I leave that up to our guests. Thank you for being here. Please welcome them.
Yeah, I think we'll have you guys get started with reading a part of your book.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to Karen for organizing, and to Max and Kelso for having for leading the discussion. And thank you all for being here. We're going to start by sort of reading a little bit from the intro of the book, and then we'll explain more the sort of the format of the book. But we thought sort of reading from the intro gives us a nice way in. It is the very beginning. So the origin of this book about queer and trans approaches to educational research methodologies traces back to a fateful conversation in July 2020. The two of us were sitting socially distanced from each other on a beach in Vancouver, Canada, catching about life, research, and the rest. From our separate beach blankets, it quickly became clear that we were both feeling rather uninspired about our research. I had just completed my first year of full-time faculty teaching, felt stuck after my initial attempts to secure a book contract had all stalled out. LJ had just finished their doctoral fieldwork a year earlier, and was in the middle of a long slog of writing their dissertation, a process made even more daunting by the extra hardships introduced by the pandemic. We talked through the pitfalls of learning to teach online and supporting students through dealing with the shifting world we understood less and less. We commiserated about stagnant writing projects, overdue book chapters, and half-written conference papers that would probably never get presented. Through our shared laments, we zeroed in on the fact that academic work was absolutely no fun now that we were having to do it alone. Like with many things that got taken away from us when the world went into lockdown, this conversation showed us how much our friendship and camaraderie with other scholars more generally had been an integral part of our support system as scholars.
The two of us met half a decade earlier during our overlapping years as doctoral students. Through a shared focus on queer and trans studies in education, we developed a closeness and a friendship that extended beyond our academic interests. As such, during our career as graduate students, we had presented our individual work together at conferences for several years, which ultimately led to our decision to co-write a conference paper. This attempt to work together, however, felt peripheral to our other projects. At that time, collaborations did not feel like as much of a priority as writing our dissertations or seeking teaching opportunities to pad our CVs. As early career scholars and graduate students, we simply did not have enough time to pursue collaboration alongside all the rest that was required. That conference paper, among some of our other joint ideas, got shelved to focus on other projects that we considered more important to our professional development and aspirational job security. However, by the summer of 2020, the attachments to our primary solo projects were waning, and we both felt frustrated by how the pandemic had deepened the propensity to labor in solitude that already seemed like an unavoidable part of the profession.
We purposely opened the book by describing this casual hangout and our friendship origin story to introduce our approach to the thinking and writing that follows. As we argue throughout the book, one of our central arguments is that what ends up as a polished, final written project about one's research has a much humbler beginnings. A train of thought after reading a powerful passage, a question that is sparked after hearing a conference presentation, or even venting about the pitfalls of academia with your friend at the beach. The pressure to make our ideas and writing conform to normative expectations of seriousness and rigor can obscure the generative quality of queer and trans relationships to research. We write this book about queer and trans research methods in education in a conversational tone with the hopes of inviting scholars of all levels into a dialogue. We acknowledge that our casual style may cause friction with the ideas about what research is supposed to look like, since we have all been trained to speak and write about research in particular ways. However, we are also aware that queer and trans topics and methodologies often do not appear as legitimate topics of inquiry in academia.
As we'll explore later in this opening, standard research conventions revolve around notions of professionalism that reify whiteness and cis heteronormativity. We learn what it means to be serious scholars, but these concepts are not objective nor neutral. As sociologists Martha Kopp and Cheryl Kleinman explain, and I quote, "Field researchers learn through their teachers, texts, and colleagues how to feel, think, and act. As members of the larger discipline, field workers share a culture dominated by the ideology of professionalism, or more specifically, the ideology of science," unquote. In writing a book that seeks to learn from queer and trans interventions, we are not trying to translate our experiences into a palatable form, one that publishers and readers will see as unquestionably fit to print. Rather, we argue that our queer and trans ways of knowing and conducting research are already valuable and legitimate. To do this work, we pull on educational philosopher and friend to the book, Adam Greteman's concept of queer thrival, which, and I quote, "reminds us that to thrive is not simply to develop well, but to develop in a way that does the work of queerness, taking a stance, an ever-changing stance against social norms." Our stance is that the field of education has much to learn from queer and trans scholars, and that queer and trans scholars are constantly learning from each other, even in the moments that don't seem or feel scholarly.
Returning to our beach hangout, this moment in the sand was when we first acknowledged that the conversations we had long engaged in were not tangential to our graduate school education, nor our training as methodologists. We realized that supporting each other did not just include providing a second set of eyes on a final draft or being each other's hype people before a job interview, which there's been a number of. We realized it meant valuing the support we gave each other and each other's work as specific political and methodological orientations. This realization, which ultimately led to write this very book together, started with us gabbing about RuPaul's Drag Race. That day on the beach, as often happens when we were together, we ended up chatting about our many thoughts on the latest season of the show. As we dished, I mentioned my frustration with a segment in the most recent episode. LJ immediately interjected to say that they shared those feelings. Through this shared lament, we helped each other to realize this wasn't just a matter of our displeasure at a TV show, but rather we were noticing elements vital to our research play out in pop culture. This conversation quickly turned into rumination on young people, research, and the relationships that queer and trans adults are allowed to have with queer and trans youth. This then turns into an article called Can the Drag Queen Speak to Her Younger Self, which is in the Journal of LGBT Youth Studies. following the tangents of our discussion, we realized that we had a lot to say. Right then and there, in the middle of our socially distant friend date, we decided to write our first article together. Looking back at that experience, it was almost as if the distance required by the pandemic made us appreciate this type of collaborative thinking as a necessity.
As scholarly friends and friendly scholars, we have spent countless hours over the past decade talking about our work, worrying about our work, providing feedback to each other about our work, and celebrating our work when we can. These conversations have been instrumental in the development of our own individual published work and that which we went on to publish together. However, said conversations are largely buried in our existing published work with little physical evidence of their existence in the text, besides a handful of citations or mentions in acknowledgement sections. We decided to write this book about queer and trans approaches to thinking and doing educational research to consider the pivotal role that such support has played in our own lives and scholarly trajectories. Further, we want to take seriously the learning and knowledge enveloped within these discussions as a distinctive methodological approach. So that is how we begin the book, which in some ways I feel like is actually, the book is a product of and a testament to friendship as well, and just the support and collaboration that sustains us as we toil in this field.
Yeah. And as a bit of the subtitle of the book is called Showing Our Work, which we actually wanted to be the title, but we got pushed back, and
here we are.
Lessons that I wish we had pushed harder on that. But this idea of showing the work that goes into all of these books and articles and things we're supposed to write, that there's often so much pressure to do, we lose sight of the work that often goes into them. Mm-hmm. And just a bit of a background of how this came to be is this book itself. We both had individual books that were from our own projects that we were in the process of coming out, and then I got, at the same time, we were also both in sessional adjunct positions with no job security. And I got an email from Routledge asking, ahead of a conference, saying, hey, we see that you have a book coming out. Do you want to talk about another book? And I literally yelled at the email, another book? I know, I'm barely finishing this book, and I don't also know if I have a job next year, blah, blah, blah. And then I didn't send that email. I just yelled at and then I was like, had this idea. I was like, LJ, what if we pitched a book together? And at first we sort of, I think you also then yelled at me.
I was like, wait, no, I can't write another book. I'll never write another book.
But there was something about if what might it mean for us to do this together. We'd already been writing this article, which was, and we had other things to say. We originally pitched a book, but the proposal was what turns out to be the third chapter of this book. And when the feedback came back, they wanted us to sort of expand things. And then as we were forced to expand things, we realized, we don't just have this to say. We also have this to say. We have this to say. And it is conversations we've been having over the 10 years, because we had them originally as grad students, or because they were originally conference presentations, right? They never sort of, and we sort of pushed them off as, those are just ideas that were cute for us then. Yeah. But what might it mean to actually sort of put those to paper and think through them more loudly?
Because when you approached me to do this, I thought that was an untenable idea. And part of making it feel possible was I wanted us to not just try to always be creating new things, but to be understanding what we had already been creating together. Yeah. And so the chapters of the book are stepping back into conversations that we've been having through the decade we had already been working together. How the book is sort of set up is that each chapter focuses on a specific element or dilemma or piece of research that we've had ongoing conversations about. And in the first half, we bring in new theory to think through it. And in the second half, we actually enter into a dialogue that often involves us returning to old data or data that never got used, that sat on the proverbial cutting room floor, and rethinking and reimagining our relationship to that work.
And putting it all to paper, putting these these conversations to paper in ways that we thought really spread out. They collapsed the conversations we've had over 10 years and sort of array it as one cogent thing. But putting them together all at once shows you the work that we've done, and that it's not just sort of these errant conversations, but they amounted to something. So
I can leave it there for you.
Yeah. Something I really appreciated about this text was the conversations and the way that you aren't trying to give this definitive answer, but rather show how these things are worked out between you two. So sort of in the spirit of that, I wanted to ask about what it's like to be doing this work at this current moment, where there's this scrutiny and surveillance of trans and queer scholars, as well as trans and queer youth who you are working with. How are you navigating that? I also know you guys are in different locations, so that might look differently for you than it might for us here in the US. So can you talk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah. Well, I think also to acknowledge, yes, we both live in different countries, but we're both from the US.
Yeah.
And have gotten out in various ways. So, I think as we all know, I've written every paper or grant proposal or anything I've written has started off the paragraph of in these horrible times doing this work, right? The different ways I've had to say that, and obviously not trying to be flippant, but how to it's actually one of the things I've realized that it's forced me to go back to some older texts. I've been reading a lot of stuff written by people in the 80s and 90s. Obviously especially people writing about AIDS in moments when we didn't know a lot, right? And they were sort of writing in 1986, 1992, when there was the things we've learned since. They're writing without that knowledge. And so it's not just reading them, but reading them, seeing what they're saying about future or moving forward or action or what to do in the face of what we sort of look back and see as a complete an abyss, right? It's been really helpful to see what are the parallels of how can we apply those lessons today? We don't know what's happening next, right? It feels like every day there's something worse and worse, right? So, but that those lessons are helpful to remember that there's space to sort of move around that and in that way.
And I think a lot of the book is us also thinking about already the increased scrutiny that we feel as being queer and trans or queer bodies moving through spaces where you're working with young people, especially queer and trans young people. And so we work out some of the ways that we collided with, what makes a good, appropriate adult or mentor for a young person, and how that does actually conflict, I think, in a very deep foundational way with what it means to be a queer person and curate and cultivate queer sociality in spaces, especially with young people. I, in the time that we were working on this book, got a position in a child and youth studies program. And I am the first and only trans person there. And it does feel like this sort of interesting and funny, my other book, I write a lot about pedagogy of desire and how I'm not interested in inclusion, I'm not interested in accommodations. I want us to actually desire there to be trans young people and operate from that space, which does feel like a kind of controversial, weird thing to say when everyone's like, you're a groomer. And I'm like, yes. Cool. Glad we agree. But I think I'm doing it for, because I do think, and this is, I think that we make queerness and transness possible through educational spaces in a lot of ways. That was true for me. And though, since I have family here, I'll tell you that we might flippantly joke that, there is a conversation in the family that I am gay because I was a feminist gender and sexuality studies major. It's not untrue, I hadn't heard, I remember the moment I heard genderqueer in a feminist theory class, and I was like, oh, that's what that is. And so I care deeply. We write in the book about the sort of ways that education and queer and trans studies miss each other and fail to really learn from and speak to each other in dynamic, rigorous, deep ways. And I think especially now having this position in a child and youth studies program, I just think it is so important for us to not argue against this idea of being dangerous or perverted, and instead say there's nothing inherently risky about queerness or transness, and it's incredibly important that we're able to have these relationships and spaces with queer and trans young people, especially now, but especially always.
Yeah, I think there's several things, going back to what Max was saying about that, I really appreciate that the book offers methodologically, and one of those things being how serious you take conversational work. and the research process against sort of like the officializing standards of knowledge production in the university. And you sort of show us a multitude of ways we can know and think and learn as scholars and students in a space where we like must constantly front as experts in a field, and deny that like we're always learning, even from those who are younger than us or less trained in a disciplined silo. So I think that maybe it would be helpful as a grounding question to think about like what your background, like your field work was in that helped you write this book, and the work that you did with youth. If you wanted to touch on those.
Sure, yeah. So my first book is called Going Along with Trans, Queer, Non-Binary Youth. It's about a study I did with young people in New York City, where I did go-along mobile interviews, which are these interviews, walking mobile interviews that are specifically sort of intended to be set in step with everyday routines. So rather than sort of, as many people do walking interviews where you just meet for a walk and talk, the go-alongs sort of meet are in step with their daily routine. So I would meet youth after school, at work, at home, and move with them throughout the city as they went about their daily routines, with the idea of talking about sort of everydayness as everydayness is happening, right? There's something about, if I were to ask you about your commute to work every day, it would be hard to tell me about. It's harder to tell me about it because it's something you do every day, right? Whereas if I'm in the car with you and be like, oh, why didn't you turn there? Or like, what, like you're driving really fast. I don't know, but there's something that the everydayness helps, the closest helps unpack it. So the book is, I did these go-alongs in over 6 months with 12 young people. And I went, I had lived in New York previously and went back and sort of relearned the city in a multitude of ways that I never had expected. I went to parts of the city that I had never been to before. I went to spent much time in parts I was familiar with and got to know those areas in totally different ways, spending time with different people. And it sort of forced me to think about how do I represent these experiences? I set out to research the everyday, the sort of the granular, the sort of the quotidian, and each of these go-alongs was a symphonic experience of moving through New York. And in trying to figure out how to write that, I was, pushing back against this idea of like, I need to turn this into a methodology chapter and 3, thematic chapters and do this and this. And I was resisting it, and I just started writing out these narratives of each go-along. And so the book, after much consternation and 3 publishers who rejected it, it reads as a series of essays of each of individual go-alongs. So just like you're sort of, every time you walk in New York, you turn the corner, it's a whole new world, right? Each chapter, you meet me with one of the young people, and it sort of picks up a snippet of the go-along. That chapter ends, you move to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So you sort of see what young people's research New York City in various ways as you sort of move through the streets with different people in different times. And it was really important for me to represent the research process itself, not to say, I'm very much a character in this book, and it's, putting yourself as a researcher into your research is a sort of often taboo, naughty thing. But I do it purposely so that you as the reader see me as well. I want myself to be present. I want the questions I ask to be present, to be seen. I sort of put you in my head as I'm thinking through things, and I sort of invite you to say, oh, why did Sam think that about what that young person said, right? I would think something different, and I sort of invite that as that's a feature of the book and not a bug, right? I want us to see this is how I took it, and you would have taken it somewhere else, because we're all not going to make the same sense out of something. So for me to have written a book that I said this is the official story of what these 12 young people's lives were like, was disingenuous to sort of the experience and what I think the trust they put in me to sort of share their experiences with the world. So that's sort of the book and how I ended this project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then my background's in youth work, and when I was doing my Ph.D., I did a year-long ethnography in a high school in the area, and I worked with 6 trans non-binary young folks, and so I went to school with them every day from September through the end of June, which a lot of people are like, oh, you went back to high school, what's wrong with you? And a big part of my interest in doing that work was, coming from youth work, coming from academic work with young people as well. I was really just so tired of hearing about how they're at risk, it's so dangerous, suicide rates, depression, all of these things. Not to say that it's not important to document harm, and what are we just missing and not taking seriously, not paying attention to, because we're so fixated on struggle and danger and death. So I was just, well, what opens up? And I ended up focusing on the labor that young people do in schools as they navigate these contexts. And part of that labor that I was really interested in was the worlds that they build out of adult surveillance. And now I'm older, but I have historically looked very young. You just have to trust me. And I was invited into these worlds in part as a trans person, but also in part, relatedly, because of the ways that I didn't easily become an adult to them, that I sort of existed in this kind of liminal space. I think that comes a bit from youth work, it comes a bit from being a trans person. There's a lot of things that inform that. But so that was sort of the ethic that I had in that space.
Yeah, one of the stories that really struck me in the book was your experience of not being perceived as an adult by another adult in the space. Would you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
And also, I guess, about this interesting position of navigating like your relative privilege and power to these youth, like through being an adult, through whiteness, through maybe being like not affected by trans misogyny, but then also understanding yourself as like very directly impacted by like transphobia in terms of like a lot of the people that you were moving through that space with, and potentially also facing that from other adults in the space.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real, that's like a real side interest of mine. I did write an article about it when I was doing that. That's called "What Grade Are You In?" So for more information. But yeah, it's such a, I think it is such a queer and such a trans experience. It's especially a trans masc experience. And it's interesting because there are ways that it really reveals how adults treat young people in schools. You know, if I'm walking down the hall and a teacher sees me and I say hello, and he's like, all right, and keeps walking, and then it goes, oh, I didn't realize it was you. And I was like, but who did you feel like it was okay to do that to? Just if I was a teenager, you could ignore me. So it did sort of reveal those things. I write a lot about, there's this sort of privilege of information and closeness that you get because I, didn't seem like a regular adult. And so I would get invited into conversations where I was constantly reminding people, like, I'm a graduate student, I'm a researcher, this is, like, I take notes on everything that we're doing, It's a weird dynamic, but making sure really that they knew, and I think I appreciate you bringing in the privilege aspect of it, because I think I had a sense that some of this was going to happen just because of my time in youth work and as like a person moving through the world getting read as young, and the ways that sort of has affected a lot of my interactions with like authority figures. But I didn't, so I was really clear with myself, like, who am I accountable to while I'm doing this? And so it's the young people that I'm working with. So whenever situations would arise that were kind of sticky, it would just be like, okay, who are you accountable to? And I think that part of it was recognizing that I am being read in a way that is like allowing me to generate more rich data. And also, I'm not a young person. They might read me that way, but I'm not. And I have access to a lot more resources and sort of like social capital than they do. So it was then making sure, I said, like, researchers aren't supposed to be as big of a part, there's all these ideas about the role that you're supposed to play. And I was like, well, fuck it. I'm here to be accountable to these young people. So yeah, sure, I'm gonna help you campaign for this all gender washroom, or like, I'm gonna support you in making this complaint against a teacher, or like, I'm gonna go with you to this meeting because just my presence there is gonna help you out. So I think it was that constant negotiation of just really noticing.
I was going to say, I really appreciate the way that both of you actually do a good job of approaching it as like a study with the youth that you're working with rather than a study of the youth that you're working with, and that you're very clear on how you are showing up and the decisions that you're making in this book, and what conversations you do include and what parts of the information that you do include and what you decide maybe you don't put in. I think it also goes back to the conversation of like, what do we owe to the participants that we're working with, and to the people that we include in our research. And so I was wondering if you could say more maybe about like almost participants and like the idea of like that you get into there about the book where you describe it as people who are nearby or on the fringe of your research, or people who participated in some way but you didn't necessarily go forward with signing a consent form, and the decisions that you made in terms of including or excluding them if you needed to.
Yeah, I think so. In the first chapter, we introduced the concept of the almost participant. So, like Kelso said, who are the people in your study, especially when you're doing ethnographic work, that are on the fringes, the friends of your sort of key observants. For me, it was the sort of friends of people I did interviews with, and how those, and one of the things that inspired this chapter was that for a long time, I was threatening, to whom I don't know, but just out loud, into the air, threatening to write a paper about what I learned about my study from all of the people who refused to, or who declined to participate. Right? Not that I was going to write about them in detail,
Just gonna troll
but like
them.
that I was like but based on the people who said yes to me and the people who said no, there was something about those. There seemed to be some patterns of who was saying yes, and right, a lot of the people who were saying yes for me were people who showed up the center where I worked, who would show up to this youth center alone. For lack of terms, they were not in a bad way, but loners in some ways. But the people who showed up, it's not that they didn't have friends, but contrary to this idea about young people who always traveling in groups of 5 or more, right? Most of the people in my study were always by themselves. And I think doing this very intimate research event where I sit by your side and walk by through the streets of New York City with you for hours on end, right? I don't think, at least the way I was doing it, the way in which I was read by the young people in this space, right? It just worked out that it worked out better in this case with a lot of young people who often made those journeys solo. And a lot of them, I think, ended up, they were people who my presence, the sort of privileges that my body experiences, like was helpful to them, right? When I was going through the consent form with, as you do with participants, a number of times, I was going through, these are all the potential risks for the study, blah, 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 right? And a couple of them just stopped me, like, risks? Like, if you're on the subway with me, like, my ride's gonna be so much safer, right? I'm gonna be able to, like, so it really pushed back on these ideas of what are these normative conventions around consent, around getting people to sign these forms as these sort of contract that's a really sort of a CYA for the universities, right? And also these, important to acknowledge, these are both projects we did as grad students. So it was really our first time by ourselves in sites, doing this work and having to navigate these sort of boundaries. So these questions about the almost participant, there was so much, there's things as I went to write my book, I was like, it's kind of this like analogy of like the court case of like what's the evidence that is properly entered into the court and what's the evidence that is improperly entered into court, and then the judge makes the jury ignore that evidence that they heard, right? Like you heard this thing, but you can't include it in your deliberation, right? So for us, there were many parts of these things that, well, we learned this from these people, but they're not part of the study. So what is an ethical way to include it? And it's not that we're not saying we were like, okay, let's just pull these people in who did not sign consent forms, but what can we sort of see about the study, especially, I think a lot of my stuff has to do with positionality and thinking through that. So the introducing this term, I think, was helpful to sort of think through, what's an ethical way to sort of show these learnings, but without sort of making objects of the people who didn't want to be part of it.
Yeah, I'm interested in, like, you kind of talk about, like, you're not throwing out the idea of consent, but, like, you are pushing against
To be clear.
to be clear, but, like, you are pushing against this idea that consent operates in this, like, one-time contract, and once you have that sign-off, you're good to do anything with anything that you collect. And so I'm interested in sort of talking about, like, how we build and maintain ethical and reciprocal research relationships. like emphasis on maintain, like not just doing the first part and being like I'm good, but like how do I go throughout this entire relationship with ethics in mind and with power dynamics in mind.
Yeah, sorry. It's such a, because I think that a lot of the Almost Participant is about us trying to have this really rigorous conversation about consent. And the way that consent, as you were saying, gets approached often by the university is it's a sort of checklist to protect them from liability. And, you know, I was talking about when I was entering into the project, I actually sat down and I was like, who am I ethically accountable to in this project, you know, and kept that as, you know, the foundation and what to return to in sticky moments. And I think that part of what we're trying to do with the book is show that like we each had a lot of work that we did individually in our own projects to be very accountable to young people, be accountable to not like reifying certain types of narratives and tropes about them, but that accountability is also bolstered through our relationship with each other. So part of the work that you know, when I was, like I had this just like massive data, it's so much data, you know, every day in a high school from September to, it's a lot of data. And I really didn't want to code it because that actually felt unethical to me. Working with genderqueer, gender nonconforming young people, and I think both of us do a lot of work to resist the idea of like knowing young people and that as the goal. And then you have to write this dissertation and like prove that you deserve to graduate, you know, and that you know enough. And so both of us, I think we're trying to work through what does it mean to know when we're not trying to stabilize and cohere knowledge about young people. And so I remember when I finished, I had, you know, Sam is a little bit older than me and finished first. Sam hadn't transcribed and had been doing a lot of work methodologically to push back on the sort of formula that we're given as graduate students. And I had all this data and I didn't want to code it. And we had conversations about it. And this is what ends up animating the third chapter. Which is called
What You Gonna Do with All That Data?
And for me, the answer was you're going to make maps of it. But I think that part of what the whole point of the book is to think about how if we are being accountable to our ethics and our political commitments, it requires a different way of thinking about research, a different way of thinking about our relationship to our participants, way of thinking about how power operates in these spaces, on our bodies, on their bodies. And so trying to really attend to like a rigorous ethic that's not about liability and pull that through the entirety of our work.
Well, something that in the years I was sort of initially presenting the go-alongs and working towards the book, I was writing all these things which I thought were like really interesting and hopefully theoretically dense and methodologically interesting. And then I would, every time I gave a presentation or talking about my work, someone would invariably, the first or second question would be, someone would raise their hand and say, are you still in touch with your participants? And at first I was like, it was sort of the years after, and the answer was yes and no, blah, blah, and I was like, sort of uncomfortable answering it, and then I was like, starting to realize I was starting to get mad about it, and I was like answering, I was giving very snarky answers, or having to like really retain my, and then I was like, Sam, what you have to think about this, what's going on, because there's something, what's causing you to be so, to get your back up about this, and then, not luckily, it happened, then the pandemic happened, so then I didn't give a presentation for 2 years. So I had time to think about it. And I realized there's something about that question, about are you still in touch with your participants, or in the years after, that it pointed back to this idea that, I think to your point about like having these ethical relationships and how long they last and how do you prove that? There seems to be this move towards, if you can't demonstrate that you are still in touch with your participants for years and years and years, that like maybe you aren't doing research well enough, that maybe you're not being ethical enough, right? And it's not sort of across the board, but there's, especially with youth work, especially within sort of education circles, there's this idea of like, I've heard many people give presentations, but like my participants and I would like to thank you for listening to my paper, right? Which is this sort of extreme of it. But I realized there was something in that question: are we expecting people who once took part in a research project to be participant forever, right? Are you always a subject? And I think especially since we were working with young people, right? I mean, all the young people in my study are now in their 30s, right? Or now, so they're no longer youth, and they are also no longer participants, right? So this way of like talking about these two categories, which they're often identified as, hello moth, their identities that they have long shed or long given up, right? And participant is never really identity that someone claims, right? Just because you once signed a consent form and did a couple interviews with me, like, are you always a participant, right? So I was unpacking this ideas of what does it mean? Like, what, are we not treating perhaps, no one ever asked me the question, are your participants still in touch with you, Sam? Right? It's always like, have you, Sam, like force yourself into their lives in some way, right?
I'll get questions that's like, what did they think of your dissertation? It's like, well, one of the 17-year-olds that I worked with wanted to read my dissertation, and no one else wanted to because they're 14, 15 years old. Like, no one wants to read your dissertation. It's like they had better things to do. One of them did, and like texted me and read it from like 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. or something. I woke up to so many texts that were just like, oh, and this, and so that was fun. But it's like, it doesn't become more ethical because we keep you in this participant relationship forever.
It also seems like maybe there's something there about them like wanting you to move them out of the participant role and into some other form of a relationship with you as researchers after. Do you get the sense that maybe is?
Whenever, because there is one participant in the book that we're still in touch, and they're in their mid-20s now, and we still actually we have a friendship, and whenever I tell sort of the particularities of that, because I get the same question, and if I talk about this one person, I think people feel really heartwarmed. Like, it makes them feel good, which is really more information about like them and the way that we think about research and the way that we think about young people. It's less heartwarming for me to be like, oh yeah, I put it all on the table and I said whatever kind of relationship you want moving forward, whatever kind of involvement, and they're like, I'm good. Like, had a great year later, and that's not as heartwarming of a story.
I think also there's, in this age of social media and reality television and having these parasocial relationships with people that we see on our phones every day, right? Like, there's something about we read or hear about something and we're invested in that person. And I think, to be very blunt, I think, especially as youth researchers, those questions imply, the back half of the question is, did that young person's life get better, right? Did they grow up to be okay, right? Which, and I obviously, if there's nods in the room, we don't have to explain why that's troubling, right? But like, I think the way to think differently about that is to think about, as a reader of someone else's research, you do not have an intimate relationship with the people that I'm writing about, right? Like, your relationship, the people in my book, Scarlett, John, you founded, right? You read about them. They did not give you the consent form. This is why we're not throwing out consent. The consent form only allows you to see the sliver I'm showing you, right? You don't get access as the reader to what happened after the go-along ended. You also don't get access to what's happened now 10 years later, right? But the point of this is hopefully is for people to read this and think about these snippets and then apply them to your own life, to the people you may interact with, to the students in your classrooms, to people you interact with on the street, right? So it's the goal is not to just think about the 11 people I talked about, or the 6 people LJ talked about, right? But to apply these snippets and these lessons to our own lives. So the focusing, I think the focus on like, oh, are you still in touch with your participants? Like, can you tell us the postscript to the epilogue, right? Like, I think how can we resist that in our own research and our own telling of stories, so that I opened the book by talking a go-along where the young person's grandmother called them as the first steps of our go-along, and then the young person was on the phone saying, like, explaining to grandma who they were with, right? And I was saying, oh, I told you, Grandma, well, I'm doing this thing. He's doing a dissertation for college, whatever. And then they just yelled, he's just following me around to see what I do every day. And I was like, it was literally the last go along I did. We weren't going to do it. It was scheduled last minute. I was leaving the next day. All of the rest of them had gone great. And then here's this young person being like, he is just my stalker. And I'm like, it's also like, I'm like, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like nothing about what you said is untrue, but also
Oh my God, it's
not
so
the way to explain the study to your like trans and sensitive grandma. Like, you know, like that. So yeah. So this, I think there's something about research. Like, I think this idea of there's been lots of movement to undo the sort of colonial, extractivist notions of research, right? And I think in that movement, there's this idea that like we can let go of them altogether, right? But I think there's still something about research with like. I, as a researcher, want to interview you and then take something from your life to show other people. Right? There's something like it's to think that we can get rid of it all. I don't know that is a reality. But to acknowledge what are the parts of it that are still there and how can we deal with them, I think is like I was just following John around, right? So how can we do it in a better way? To think that we can sort of let go of it in its entirety, I think is perhaps giving us too much credit of that's just me.
Yeah, there's a moment where you talk about not thinking of things like definitely as problems, but as like how do you work with them, which I think maybe resonates with that, and like sort of this tension between like not manufacturing closeness or like pretending you're something you aren't to someone, but also not operating in this extremely extractive type of way. Very interesting kind of conversation there. That makes me think a little bit as well, because I worked as a journalist, often with queer and trans youth, and then I also worked as a youth worker with queer and trans youth. And there are some people that I'm still like friends with and like in touch with, and then there's also some people who it's like they wanted that to be the container and then to move on.
Right.
So, yeah.
I know that you, LJ, talked a little bit about the avoiding of like danger, risk narratives, and at the end of the book, you both kind of touch on that as well, about not wanting to just go into those sorts of like narratives about queer and trans youth as always at risk or always facing some sort of like massive barrier that like puts them in danger. But I also think when you were receiving those questions, it does feel a bit like, tell me that everything is good then. Like, and there's also a need, I would say, to avoid just like glossing over all of the hardships that go along. And so these projects are giving us like snippets of time and what happened and what we can do with this information and this knowledge that we do have, rather than trying to make it into some grander narrative.
Yes.
And I guess I was just curious about like how you go about structuring research in a way that doesn't predetermine some sort of narrative, and it's not like ironed out and just like, here's all my data and here's this, but it also doesn't avoid doesn't go towards one of those poles.
Such a good question. And I'm also going to use that question to briefly complain about queer joy, as it's one of my favorite things to do. Working on a piece right now with my colleague Key Alexander on this, and because I think so if we look genealogically, which my postdoc research was a genealogy of how at-risk got attached to predominantly white, queer, and trans, at first lesbian and gay young people. And so looking at actually the historical development of why risk and what was risk doing, because it was a strategy, it was actually very intentional coming from educators to use this term to get people to care. And this is a lot of what it is, right? If we can document to you that these young people are really struggling, hopefully we're like getting at you to step up and advocate for them, to make GSAs in your schools, to whatever it is at the time. There's often this sort of pendulum swing discursively where we'll have risk and then people are like, oh, well, but they're not just at risk, they're also resilient, you know? And it's actually just the same conversation. And then, so it sort of goes in this latest way, and queer joy is the current way that we wanna sort of have a really overly reductionist, simplistic, whitewashed conversation about what it means to be a queer person. My prediction is that next is going to be pleasure. So anyway, getting this on record now. If queer pleasure is the next big thing, buy me a beer. Anyway, it is really, I think a lot of the work that both of us do in our own publications and thinking, but also together, is how to resist the stability of knowledge, the stabilizing of knowledge, which is often the imposition of knowledge. Because I think a lot of where we get like this risk, this resilience, this queer joy, it's people who are coming in and looking and using young people as sort of objects for knowledge production, as like figures instead of real people, instead of real people who have like knowledge and can articulate their own experience. Because I don't know, you know, you in youth work as well, have you ever come across a young person who self-identified as at risk? You know, it's very uncommon. Because these are ideas that we are bringing to it. And we're always bringing ideas to our research, right? I'm no like, just like what, like pure interaction. Obviously I have ideas. I came in not wanting to do risk. Part of the hope was that in just letting the young people show me and tell me about what they cared about and how they moved through the world and what they did and what they wanted and what they desired, and trying to be as open as possible to letting them direct and guide me in those ways, that I would learn so much more than fit into tidy categories. And so again, not coding, for instance, not giving any sort of closure about who these young people are, so that you resist this idea that we need this like one trope, this one discursive lens to help us understand. It's like, we don't actually have to understand. The worlds that they were building existed in such a vibrant, dynamic, generative way because they were not understandable to the adults who were around them. And so how do we continue to invest in that sort of dynamic and relationship? I don't need to know your gender to care about you. I don't need to understand exactly what this means for you and have it be stable over time for me to care about you.
I think along those lines, something that was important in my Go Along book was to, in the sort of having the chapters go from go along to go along, is that, you know, many of them end, they don't all the chapters don't end with the end of the go along, but a number of them do, and it's often sort of me standing there watching a young person fade into a crowd, right? And I sort of write elsewhere that, you know, it's in my sort of when people want to know more about my research or know more about these people's lives, I'm not saying I disagree with you. Like, I also want to know. Like, I share that desire in some ways because, you know, I know what it's like to watch these young people, like, you know, walk down the sidewalk because there's like, you know, 10 questions I haven't asked them and still want to ask them, but the go along's over, right? And that's because they're done, right? So I don't get to ask them, and that's what I have to deal with, right? So how can sort of we apply that to our thinking about what is it you learn from the people you read about in other people's research, or the people in your classrooms, or the people you interact with, right? Like, this idea that you can like fully know, this idea that you can know everything. Like, we have the sort of resisting of those, that desire, that sort of yearn, to LJ's point about but it doesn't mean you can't have a good relationship. Doesn't mean you can't like move forward with something. But this idea of knowing it all and getting 100%, right? Like it's grilled into us.
Yeah, I think especially because since we're both education scholars, there's this way that sometimes I'll have conversations with teachers or teacher candidates, and they're like, but what do I do? Just tell me the right order of operations when I see that a young person is trans in my class. I'm like, well, already we're having really different conversations. I want you to treat everyone as if maybe they could hopefully be trans. I'm a groomer. This is being recorded. Okay. But I think that it's this, because I appreciate you saying, like, we feel that desire as well. And we write, I mean, our second chapter is all about desire and the like many complicated ways that it shows up in research. How do you face that desire, acknowledge that desire, and work to consistently resist, cementing knowledge about young people.
I think there is we ingrain these sort of like theories of change of like how we can change their lives, how we can do things differently. And when like they're posing those questions to like, what do I do? It also then presumes that the children and the youth don't also know what to do, and that they can't offer that as well as things to do, rather than like we need to have some adult, some expert tell us what to do and what needs to be fixed and how to fix it, rather than listening to what children and youth are actually desiring and want, and the directions they want to go in, and the structures that they're actually building for themselves without our imposition. Max, did you want to go into the next?
One thing about that though, it reminds me a little bit about like the experience of being in a room and suddenly a pronouns circle erupting because of your own presence, and you know that
now
like,
that you're
actually,
here, we remembered about gender.
Had you not been there, they wouldn't have started the circle.
Yes.
Or like only being the one person that's asked like, okay, so what are your pronouns? And then you tell them and then they don't actually use them.
Yes.
And so I don't know, and I think there's this interesting thing that we face, especially as queer and trans people, of this issue of visibility not necessarily being like a good thing. And like maybe wanting to lean into like the illegibility, or like lean into like somebody not understanding your experience perfectly. And you actually don't have to explain it to every random stranger that you meet.
That's a big part of the first book. It's just like the labor that young people do to navigate the desire for illegibility, but being legible as illegible, and how do we not resolve that tension for them?
And so you also touch a little bit on the desire piece and the relationship piece, and that was sort of making us think about like, we have this ongoing necessity as trans and queer people to create community and even like family with each other. You talked about queer sociality, but there's also a lot of barriers that can like restrict that ability to forge those intergenerational queer and trans bonds. Like part of it is like literal absences because of an entire generation that was so affected by AIDS and continues to be affected. Part of it is the fear of being seen as a groomer, or being seen as like inherently perverted, and now you're around a child. And so I was hoping that maybe we could just touch on like a memory of experiencing that kind of connection. It could be in your research or your personal or professional life, of having that intergenerational connection and what it means, what it maybe doesn't mean.
So some of the work I'm doing now is I've spent some time going back to writings from the 90s. I've been looking at the work of two gay male education scholars and former early childhood educators who wrote a lot in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. It's Jonathan Sillen and Eric Roefs. And it's stuff, I had read both of them sort of before going to graduate school, or one before graduate school and one in the early days of grad school. And they were writing about, there's an article called Teaching as a Gay Man, the other one, The Pervert in the Classroom, Bound and Gagged, Gay Silences and Gay Teachers, something long subtitle. They're all written like around 1997, 99. And they're asking questions about these, looking at what does it mean that like something about gay man and teacher seem irreconcilable, right? And that if we don't unpack the ways in which these sort of what we now talk about is the groomer narratives, what they were back then talking about perverts and ingrates, right? Like inverts if we don't unpack these sort of what is causing these moral panics around children and sexuality, right? If we can't fully unpack the ways in which these are connected, they're going to sort of repeat themselves. And reading these things from almost 20 years ago, sort of echo, sort of reverberate today in this way, like, oh, what they said was true. It has come around again. So spending, and I've actually, Eric sadly passed away in 2005, but Jonathan Still and I actually were writing a piece that sort of is another intergenerational dialogue about me asking him about the pieces he wrote, how they came to be. He and I sort of have a shared history of sort of dancing through the academy in an interesting way that wasn't sort of like just getting in a tenure track professorship so that in looking at it's actually been quite helpful for me to think about how having these conversations. He sort of reminded me like of things that like I haven't maybe given myself enough credit for. We got to this, the article sort of spans teaching to talking about like flirtations and romances and how those things are all important. And something that he and Eric both argue is that their learnings as gay men, their experiences as gay men of being in sexual subcultures, of being in BDSM or kink communities, of taking care of loved ones who were dying from AIDS, right? All of those things made them better teachers. All of those things, in fact, made them teachers, right? But they were never able to sort of talk about, in their teaching origin story, this is what made me a good teacher, because of where those lessons came from, right? But they talk about those are all lessons about power, about democracy, about citizenship, about taking care of each other, right? That like are things we would hope for in our teachers. So what happens when the lessons come from these spots that don't seem teacherly or teacher-like? And one of the things I read about in this thing with Jonathan is that I had unsurprisingly, in high school I was in theater camp, and it was the summer I came out between like 9th and 10th grade, and there was a gay college student who was one of the teachers, and I was, so he was maybe 4 or 5 years older, which at that point seemed like 1,000 years, right? And so I sort of came out to a group of girls halfway through the project by telling them, I'm like, oh, I'm halfway through the camp, I'm like, oh, I'm like Matt, right? And that was Matt was. And we sort of talked about a week, and then I don't remember, I came out to him at some point, which I don't remember, but what I do remember is that the closing night after the show, and I think I was literally like still in old age makeup from the show, he came up to me and said, he gave me this book, he said, thank you for telling me, and gave me this book, and gave me a hug and a kiss on the cheek, and then that was it. And back then I was like, oh, I thought we were gonna get married, right? Right, but it was like that moment of actually like, of acknowledging me, of giving me this sort of intimate, appropriate gesture. He gave me this book that was one of the sort of 1950s pulp novel about a young boy from the English countryside who moves to London and becomes a rent boy, right? I learned a lot from the book. I learned what a punter was, what a pedagogical moment of nothing that was untoward, but there's ways in which it could be read in different ways. And I've told this story a lot, but actually recognizing how much impact it was. But we can have a bond, but this is the limits of the bond, right? And there's still ways of connecting. But think about how many situations even that wouldn't have happened, right? The giving of materials, the intimate gesture, which meant a lot. So.
In the book, we write about this moment that we had when we were presenting sort of early pieces of what became the books on a panel together. And we got asked by a senior scholar that we respect a lot, where's the sex? Where's desire? And we both felt so weird about the question. We were like, oh my God, are we Puritans now? What happened to the sex in our work? That there's this really challenging tension when you are a queer trans adult who works with queer and trans youth about, being appropriate. And written the book about this young person who was an almost participant, ended up not participating. I really didn't want them to participate because they very relentlessly hit on me throughout the project. They're 17-year-old. I am a grad student, doing my dissertation. I'm in a school, and it was relentless. And I remember this time where they, put their hand on my inner thigh, and I was like, oh God, anyone could walk by at this moment. And then now I'm having a very uncomfortable conversation with the principal, being like, no, look, I didn't, and I didn't want to, I wouldn't want to be around them. It felt too precarious. It felt like it could become terrible for me so quickly. And part of what we do in this chapter is look back on the moment, because that was the wrong, that wasn't the approach that I would take now. And so I think there's this way, and why I mentioned queer sociality earlier is that, like if you think about this at theater camp and like what you're trying to express and what you're receiving back, I think like this young person was trying to do a similar thing. I was the only trans adult that they knew, and I think that they were trying to step into their queerness, step into their transness through that flirtation. You know, it hadn't, like, it wasn't about me. It was about them trying to be part of this community that they hadn't been part of before. And I shut that down because the scrutiny and the narratives that I hear had made it seem impossible that I could continue to like live a queer ethic in an age-striated, you know, school space. And so a lot of what I do moving forward when I think about my teaching is that I really try to resist that. And I was like, look, this is what happens when you hire a queer person. I am now going to be this gay in my classroom all the time. And that's actually a necessity of me being there. And so thinking about, how do I create my classroom and relationships with students in a way that does honor the unique aspects of queer sociality and doesn't feel afraid of them. But it's hard. I mean, it's especially just like with increasing scrutiny on our communities, our relationships, our bodies. Like I do feel fairly aware, you know, that I'm like one CBC article away from someone being like, trans professor tells students they should be trans, you know, and you know, you can see it.
I think that, you know, just to show that you had written an earlier version of trying to write out the story about this
trying to think through it.
and I got a desk reject from a journal, like, just writ large against the topic, right? So like, what does it mean to like, I mean, it's face, like a trans graduate student in doing a project, having this experience with a trans student, like, isn't that something that we could all learn from, right? Isn't this something like this on it, like it's something that needs to be talked about, right? But that you tried to, and it got a desk reject for this, like, presumably for like a non-traditional approach to ethics, to try and write about someone who wasn't officially a participant, right? And you know, it's not to say that everything needs to be published right away, but there's something about like, what are those rejections we've gotten that have then led it to be like, okay, well, that's done. How do I move on, right? But sometimes those rejections like are coming, you know, or being told, don't think about it, don't write about it, are things that we need to sort of push back on and you know, maybe find a friend who then also had a participant who flirted with them and then did not end up in my project, right? But here we both had an almost participants in our studies about gender and sexuality with youth. We had young people who expressed their gender and sexuality in front of us, which then disqualified them from our projects about gender and sexuality in young people, right? So this tricky, though, like, oh, we want to talk about your gender and sexuality, but not that much, right? Like
in this appropriate container.
Right. Like, so, and those weren't, I don't think either the young, like nothing, and both these young people didn't do anything wrong, and also then looking at ourselves and not belittling ourselves and like, oh, back to the section you mentioned, which is titled, "What Happens When Things Don't Go Right, comma, parentheses, but it's okay." Thank you, Whitney. Right? Like what happens, like, okay, so that happened, how can we move forward, right? And rather, because I think part of us had sort of been badgering ourselves internally about, oh, this is, I actually can't talk about this because this is maybe something I did wrong in the field, right? I, like, to your point, like, did I invite some way this young person to touch me, right? So letting go of that, like, research has to be perfect and it has to be done, but showing these sort of messy parts and this is how we've learned, and hopefully it might be helpful to someone else.
I think that's very interesting. It reminded me of like being in high school. I came out very young. I came out in middle school. And I knew I wanted to be a teacher at some point, and I literally had a thought of like, I can't do both. Like I can't be I can't be a lesbian and I can also be a teacher, or I wouldn't be able to be out to my students. And like, even in a weird, like, I was like a youth mentor, like I was an older student working with younger students, and the days that I would see them, I would dress completely different. That even though it's like we're literally in the same hallways, they could see how I was dressing otherwise. And like, also I was one of the only out lesbians in the school, so it was like semi-weird common knowledge. And yeah, it made me so sad because I had this moment where like we sort of had a thing where people put in secrets or questions or whatever, and then we read them out loud anonymously. And I had a student who put in like, I am really scared because I think I'm gay and I'm so scared and I was like, oh my God, I haven't made myself visible in this space to let that student come up to me individually and recognize me and like ask me a question or like find comfort. And that made me so sad, and it changed how I was like, okay, maybe I don't have to be in my prep uniform to interact with these freshmen as like a junior, which like wasn't even like, you know, we were all kids. So yeah, that was very, very interesting.
I was just going to reflect on, I think that the school setting, in fact, and like with like bureaucratic institutions such as schooling or coaches or sort of outside adult mentors, was where I felt the most repression back from like when I was like coming out as a young person, and I was like, that is where I felt the most restricted, rather than like amongst my peers, amongst even like adults on the outside of those sorts of like institutions. So I think that like queer and trans people and adults who are working in those sorts of institutions and places have some sort of there is a complicated dynamic that goes into
also how those legacies of schooling, we carry them throughout our lives. I'm currently doing interviews with people who are involved in various, loosely termed, like leaders in kink communities in Melbourne and in New York City. And I'm interviewing them about their work, and this work that I see as educational. Like, how are you like thinking about people who are either well-known in communities or doing stuff online or in various community settings around education about kink and sexuality. And what's coming up is there's something about when I ask them about, do you see your work as educational? There's this, and I haven't figured this out yet, so if you have any ideas, let me know after. But there's this, people have been refusing, I'm not an educator. Like maybe I'm a peer mentor, but this idea of an educator, like it's you know, that makes people uncomfortable, right? So there's something about teacher, about school, and the ways in which as an education scholar, like I'm interested in how we learn throughout our lives, right? Especially about how we learn about sex, right? So this idea of like how do these knowledges, not just the first learning, right? This idea of like, oh, when did you first see a pornographic image on the internet, right? But like how have you learned about sex from the sex you've had throughout your life, right? So but just to the point about school has this long attachments that we're still shedding. Like even when people like, as adults, like, oh, like I slept with my yoga teacher, is that weird? And you're like, I don't know, are you both adults? Like, I don't know, like, why, like, but it's like, because they're your yoga teacher, right? It's like, oh, I still have to be student, I still have to be like, you know, they linger, right? And it affects how we think about learning, and affects how we think about the knowledge we've gained and continue to, so, yeah.
I think we can open up to audience questions at this point.
I mean, I guess like picking up from where you left off, it's sort of because talking about queer education and institutional educational context is very different from thinking about, say, like the place of queer theory in academia, right? Or what that work does, and obviously, how many years ago was the Avatar and all stuff again? I can't even remember. It was like 20. Is that like 17, 18, around there?
Not that long.
Not that long ago. I don't know. It was before COVID, right? But what ended up happening, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's a theorist. I wouldn't even say Ava Talerno was a queer theorist, but a theorist. There was a controversy around this relationship between her and a graduate student who was enlisted in various doing various things and doing kinds of labor and emotional labor that was inappropriate. And then suddenly there's a kind of crisis in the field of queer studies, right? About reevaluating, reassessing this notion of boundaries and also just sort of and some people really coming down hard on queer pedagogy is queer pedagogy. You go to the bar, you look up, blah 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 blah. And then then of course it was concomitant with the Me Too, the larger Me Too movement, which is obviously emphasis on consent, emphasis on also power dynamics and power relations and the exploitation of those power relations. So I guess I just wanted to kind of invite the kind of world of theoretical practitioners, world of qualitative practitioners, or thinking through to kind of come together and think about that kerfuffle and how that moves across, I guess, different levels or realms of education.
I love this question. This is something that I think about a lot, in part because I came up through gender and sexuality studies. I was most recently at the Queer and Trans Research Lab at U of T, University of Toronto, and now I'm in a very different space. I'm in child and youth care, which is, I'm the only person there who's not married with kids. I have no intention of having kids. It's different. And I show up, or I am read differently in those spaces. And I think that there is such and we write about this, I'm writing about this in another work, there's such a disconnect at times, or this sort of distancing, or this lack of understanding or relationship between queer theory, trans theory, and education work. And so we'll read a lot of queer theorists write about children, but they write about symbolic children. So they'll write about literary figures. They're not doing work with actual young people. And it's almost like the appropriate space for queer theory in its relationship to children is children as these abstract figures, children to make a point on, children who exist as future potential. And education is then, as we've been talking about, kind of afraid of queer theory because we're like, ooh, is that okay? Here, we're talking about kids. They're not old enough to even, and all that is ridiculous. And I think so there's that piece of it. I think this other part I think about is coming back to consent. And I think what I'm so excited about with your new work is, can communities have way more depth and rigor around consent conversations? And so there's this sort of funny thing that happens, because when I say queer sociality, or when we talk about queer pedagogy, that also means that we have deep relationships to consent. And that's understanding power and different sorts of hierarchical relationships within the university and to the university. So it's not an evacuation of, right? It's a more entangled and deep interrogation of consent and boundaries.
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. My name's Aiden. This is kind of a full circle moment for me, LJ, because I was actually at that high school. I was a youth worker.
No, I recognized you when you walked in, and I was like, oh my God.
Kind of a full circle moment. I'm a Ph.D. student here at USC now. But you folks are talking about the almost participant, and I felt, reflecting back on my experiences as a youth worker at that high school, it felt like I was an almost instructor in many ways.
Interesting.
And for me, it was so difficult to translate that work into being a TA, being into a lecturer, because what I thought I knew as a youth worker, what worked with my participants, with my students, it just didn't, for whatever reason, it was a pedagogical no-no at the university level. So I was wondering if either you, Sam or LJ, if you folks could maybe talk about what do we do about TAs and folks that are almost instructors?
You can start.
Well, I think this is back to what I was saying at sort of the end about what are these sort of attachments of teacher and students and the roles, and how much those are built upon power hierarchies and differential, right? This idea of the teacher is all the knowledge and the teacher is there to give it to the students are there to receive it, right? This idea, and the way in which that plays out within sort of all educational relationships, right? And that how that sort of shifts. It kind of shifts as you get older, right? This idea of in theory, you have a different relationship to your professor than you do to your kindergarten teacher, right? But it really comes down to unpacking what we think teachers should be and how they should be, right? The ways in which Jonathan Sillen, who I wrote the article with, he talks about he was a early childhood teacher for a long time, educator, and he once was leaving the preschool where he worked, and one of his a young female student, a 4-year-old, I think, said to him he happened to be wearing a suit, which he didn't often wear a suit. On the way out of school for the day, she's like, "Oh, are you going to work now?" Right? And he was like, this idea of like, as a male teacher, this is I think in the early 80s, right? This idea, he sort of writes about, oh, does she not see me as her teacher because I'm a man? Is it because I now put on a suit and maybe her dad wears a suit to work and leaves every day, goes to the office, right? But this idea of like, so much of teacher, like, it almost in some ways he thought of interpreted it as her not even conceptualizing him as teacher because of how he appears or who he assumes he is, right? So just these ideas of teacher are so sticky. I mean, it plays out with there's so many studies done about who walks into a room at a university and is assumed to be a professor and a student along lines of race and gender and how the intersections of how those are read, right? Like so, it's it's a complicated thing. That this idea of unpacking teachers, I think there needs to be a lot more done on that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think it's so. Putting this in conversation with the earlier question conversation about teachers, like just wanting the right answer, when teachers or adults will ask, like, well, what do I do about gender in the classroom, trans kids in the classroom? Often I actually have this conversation about, let's think about the adult youth teacher-student dynamic, because it's sure, this is something that's going to affect trans young people, but also you probably don't know how many students in your classroom or your school are trans. You think that you'll know, but you don't. And that it's actually about this, the way that schools are set up, the way that so much of our society is set up, and that we have, adults have like survived the process of growing up, and now are knowledge holders, and young people are these sort of inchoate beings who have yet to make it safely through to the other side. And the way that we then devalue, don't listen to, delegitimize knowledge that young people have about themselves. And I think that sort of hierarchy exists everywhere and in so many things, right? You're not yet a teacher, Right. You're not yet a woman. So you're on your way. And so what does that mean in terms of also what that's, the ways that like race and gender and sexuality and class are gonna map onto these distinctions. So in the thing that I write about being read as a student in the school, part of what I talk about is like, well, when I was policed for, went into the washroom, it was a staff washroom, it was a staff woman's washroom, and someone came in and, pulled me out of it. But in that moment, it was like, well, is it because you think that I'm not a staff person? You think that I'm not a woman? Like, what is and it's impossible to disentangle these, right? And then they all just thought it was funny. They're like, oh my God, love to joke about it. But yeah, so I think that there's this sort of confluence of, who we see as an authority, who we see as having knowledge, that maps onto all these different aspects of, you were gonna say.
Well, I'm working on this piece sort of loosely called Dude, I'm a Fag, which is a play on C.J. Pascoe's book, Dude, You're a Fag. And it's me sort of reflecting on various educational moments. I realized that my first time ever as a teacher was me in my high school GSA as a 15, 16-year-old going and doing teacher in-services about anti-homophobia and anti-transphobia education in the late 90s in rural Wisconsin, right? So the first time I was teacher, I was a young person teaching teachers, right? I came out of the high school and there was the English department had 4 out lesbians who were my saviors, but there were no gay male teachers came out until I was graduating, after I had sort of been, and there was a number of, I was one of the many students who were out at the time, right? So you have teachers coming out after students. The first time I was ever called a faggot in a school was in my first month of student teaching, and I was called a faggot by a student in the middle of class. The first time I ever experienced like that direct homophobia in that way was when I was my first few weeks as an adult, as a teacher in a building, right? So the ways in which like queerness, like and gender pushes back on who is assumed to have the power, who is the person who has the teacher, who has the capacity to teach, right? I realized that my whole life has been my whole teaching career has been a bit askew, and really sort of putting that down to paper has been helpful to think about. What are those ways? Because to your point, I would imagine students know the difference between an instructor and a professor. Students know the difference between a student teacher and their quote unquote real teacher, right? They have these ability to know the hierarchies and maybe who they can push back against and who they can't, and whether or not they get away with it is a different thing. But it's this awareness of these how power operates in these in these environments.
Could I ask sort of a follow-up to ask Kelso or Max to answer this question
Yeah.
a little bit? Or just sort of like as in your positionalities, both as instructors but also as students at the same time, right? Like, or graduate students, like, how do you imagine your queer sociality with faculty versus with other, versus undergraduates, or in what ways are you formulating those practices?
Yeah, so I'm in my first year, so I haven't started officially TAing. But in the past, I like worked as a youth worker, but it was an interesting tension where youth is sometimes defined as like up till like 28 or 30. So some people were older than me. And
40? What? No.
Yeah, and there was but in that context, we had like a very like, we didn't want to perpetuate hierarchy, and because we were like not, you know, we were like a non-profit-ish type of organization, there was more ability to be like, hey, I'm learning as much from you as I'm teaching you, and like destabilizing the teacher relationship, which I really enjoyed, because I think it like let us directly acknowledge like our privileges and power positions, and also some of the youth were being paid to be part, you know, like there were all these weird moments where like we realized we were in not exact same precarity, but like I also ended up getting like laid off by that job, and like was also going to the food bank, and like we were sharing resources in a different way, together rather than like clear hierarchy. I think like by virtue of studying gender and sexuality studies, I got to have a lot of like interactions, I guess, with queer professors, and it was interesting to like understand like how those mentor relationships could change like once I exited the university and became like more on their level. Like I definitely had mentor relationships with like queer professors in my undergrad, and then like once I was thinking about applying to grad school, like the places we met were different, and like it didn't feel inappropriate in any sense, but like it became more of a friendship type thing. But then I still like had this tension of like, can I call my professor by their first name? I still struggle with that. Like, yeah, I still go back and forth because I feel like weird doing it. So yeah, that's been my experience of it.
I've had several years teaching now, like TAing and then some other outside teaching, but it's been a very interesting dynamic navigating this sort of like middle position, especially as a TA where I'm not the official like instructor of record, and the students know that, and they also know the things that they are able to get away with me, and I think there is definitely a dynamic that comes into play around gender and sexuality and who takes what seriously. I think that I've experienced a lot more of the like students who identify as like girls or women like coming up and telling me like, hey, just so you know, I'm bisexual, and I'm like, cool. Cool. And then I freeze. I'm like, I'm like glad that you feel that you could talk about that. Tell me more about that in your paper. But and then like the students who are maybe men, not really taking any of the work seriously, or like listening or like paying attention, and I'm like, then why did you sign up for this class? It's about these topics. So it gets to be a weird dynamic where I'm like, I feel like I'm being pushed to like compromise like who I am and like how I'm dressing and how I'm showing up to school, and navigating the relationships of the students who like maybe want to take the class seriously, or the students who like don't care, and I'm like, how do I get you all on the same level at the same time, because we only have a set amount of time in a class space, and like navigating those sort of dynamics is really difficult. And I'm like they're all young students as well, so I see them flirting with each other, and I'm like, great, do that, keep doing that, like don't bring, like please no. But it is a different dynamic where I feel like more free working with like faculty and people who are like maybe older or more experienced, or who have more like established history in a university or in a field that I want to do, where I look up to as mentors. I feel more of like the freedom to do what I want and appear how I want, and like let them sort of lead in the dynamics. Versus like with students, I'm like, I have to present it a certain way, and like I feel like in certain ways I am really like reifying that boundary of like student teacher, but at the same time I don't want to be taken even less serious by the students who I can barely get to participate and who don't want to be there. So it's difficult to say like it's in anything in particular, but I do try like. Sam, I used one of your methods in my class, the go along method, and I had them, like my students, go along with each other and like walk around and like talk to each other, and they were like, wow, this was such a like eye-opening experience. I really liked being out of the classroom and being able to talk to each other about these things that we know. And I was just like, great, love that. But like being able to like use like a queer pedagogical sense in a classroom has been really, I think, changing the dynamic of like the student-teacher or student-not-so-teacher relationship. And the students who feel like they can still like reach out to me in the hallways and be like, hey, I didn't know if you'd remember me, but I'm in blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, great, that's so nice.
Yeah, I think so.
Sounds good.
Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to our panelists once more for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for great questions.
Thank you.
I also wanted to, of course, thank our staff at GSS and the consortium, Sam Glover, without whom we could never do any programming, and our newest addition to the team, Andrea Salazar-Lopez. So thank you all, and please check out these books. And we are also soliciting pitches for next year's intergenerational dialogue. So if you're a graduate student or you teach graduate students and are interested in pitching a topic, an author or authors to be in conversation with, as we did today, then please do so. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.